and welcome to our first panel event of the year on the subject of health and humanity, the value of life in the COVID age. I'm Rohan, I'm a second year medic at Robinson College.
And I'm Wei, also a second year medic at Churchill College. And Rohan and I are going to be your hosts today.
So I don't know about you, but someone like in this last year, with all the pandemic and things, COVID has truly turned our lives upside down. And many of us have been going through loss and grief.
Yeah, we've watched our politicians have to make some really difficult decisions, our economists trying to weigh up how much protecting lives will cost us. It's forced the government to pay attention to often overlooked portions of society, like those in nursing homes and those living in our streets. And it's forced us to notice those who really are essential to the running of our country. I don't know about you, but lockdown has given me a lot of time to think about what I'm really doing with my life and what deeply matters.
So without further ado, let's introduce our panelists for today. So first we have Alice. So Dr. Alice Gerth graduated from Edinburgh University in 2014 and has worked in Oxford and Bristol before moving to Cambridge to train as an anaesthetic registrar at Addenbrooke's Hospital. During the initial COVID response, she worked on neurocritical care, caring for patients with and without COVID-19. As an anaesthetist, she sees the complexity of the COVID-19 cost, from delayed surgeries, limited visitations to those directly ill with the virus. She's a trustee of the Christian Medical Fellowship, a charity that seeks to support Christian doctors and nurses to live their faith in the workplace and speak into current ethical issues, including euthanasia, use of artificial intelligence in medicine.
And next we have James, if you can give us a wave, that's a fab. Dr. James Adams is currently working as a junior doctor in Manchester. He has a master's degree in public health and is passionate about developing preventative work within healthcare systems. He's founded 3 charities, Pregnancy Twinning, which supports the health of mums in Malawi, Uganda, and Sierra Leone, CATTS, which works to raise awareness of young adult cancers within the UK. And lastly, he is founder and CEO of Number 11, a centre based in Stoke-on-Trent, which supports a wide variety of groups, including the homeless, those struggling with substance misuse, mental health, bereavement, long-term unemployment, or financial difficulty. Number 11 focuses on supporting individuals to move from crisis to independence, not just putting a plaster over the problem, but helping individuals to make sustainable change. Number 11 is a family. It's not programmers and services that change lives, but instead relationship. And this principle underlies all the work James does.
And next we have Margaret. Could you give us a wave, please? Yeah. So Margaret Sainer joined Cambridge City Food Bank in 2018 and is now the CEO of the Cambridge City Food Bank after many years in software development and testing, most recently working in the financial information services sector. Margaret wants to put something back into the community and work with an organization based on Christian values of love and service, especially to the poor and marginalized in society.
And finally, we have Grace. If you could give us a quick wave, thank you. Grace is a junior doctor who's been working in intensive care in the Northwest throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. She read natural sciences at St. John's College, Cambridge, prior to studying graduate entry medicine at the University of Oxford. What Grace enjoys about medicine is how it allows practitioners to get to the heart of what it is to be human. She is interested in how practitioners navigate ethical pathways that uphold the dignity of those in their care. And I think that's everybody. So we've got a quick first introductory question. So about, a brief reply, about 2 minutes from each of you, please. The question is, what has COVID illuminated to you about how our society values life? And has it changed how you value life? If you've all got that, can you all jump in, please?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think the thing that struck me is how fickly we value life. So at the height of the crisis, we were very focused on the lives of those with COVID-19. Then we started to worry about people in care homes. Then we shifted our view to the Black Lives Matter movement. Now we're thinking about school children, and we're not really able to hold all of those together. We sort of jump from we value them, we value them, we value them. And it makes it very hard to have conversations about health utility, economic costs, impact of decision making. And I think trying to hold those together and trying to value all life equally is really hard in this type of situation. And I think that's the thing that I've been very struck by, is that in principle, I value all life equally. I think that God loves all of us the same. But in practice, that's really hard when I'm faced with a decision that is essentially, do we use a critical care bed for a patient with COVID-19 that's got a 50% chance of survival, or do we use it for the potentially curative cancer surgery patient that's going to have a 12-hour operation and needs a bed? Ultimately, these are decisions we've had to make. So Addenbrook's closed all its elective work for 2 months, and we've now got patients who've had cancer surgery delayed by 2 months, and no longer it's curative. So I've realized that it's not as simple as saying, I value all life. We have to make decisions, and it's really hard.
Thank you.
I'll jump if you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's really struck me about the pandemic, which I suppose is unsurprising, is that there's been a huge focus on statistics and numbers, and so very, very quickly deaths and people just become numbers. And I've had a load of conversations which have just been really interesting. For me, I'm in general practice at the moment, so kind of quite far removed from the hospital, but seen an awful lot of people maybe start to really wrestle with questions about what life is. And I think when we reduce life down to a statistic, or we treat life as either kind of alive or dead, and that is a kind of binary issue, we don't kind of recognize that actually life is meant to be so much more than just surviving. And I've had so many really, really interesting conversations with people over the last couple of months, and a lot of my friends who don't share my faith, who are starting to ask questions about, actually, is this all that life is? Is this all that I am here for, just to survive and just to get through, and to get through the miserableness that is lockdown, and get through the difficulties and challenges that so many people are facing? And so I think one of the things that's really struck me is we maybe devalue life by seeing it as just a binary, you're alive or you're not, and treating it as numbers and statistics, and not realizing actually that certainly from a Christian point of view, we know that the Bible and Jesus promises life, and life in all its fullness. Are we always experiencing that? And I think a lot of people are now starting to ask questions about that, and wondering, is this it?
Thank you.
I think one of the things, so before the pandemic struck, we had about 200 volunteers. Cambridge City Food Bank is almost entirely staffed by volunteers. And most of our volunteers were in the sort of category where they needed to be shielding, or at least pulling back from the front line. But we saw a huge outpouring of support, people offering to help. You know, we lost about 100 volunteers in the first week. We gained nearly 200 offers of help. And I think one of the things that shows is how much people want to help. You know, they see the pandemic. They know that actually going into a distribution centre where all sorts of people are going to be coming in could actually be risky for them, but they still want to help. And I think that's one of the big things that I've seen out of this, is just the amount of love and desire to support people that we've seen. And you know, one of the things that we really value as part of the food bank is that everybody who comes into us is a person. They're valuable, they've got their needs, their desires. Nobody chooses to come to a food bank, but everybody has needs. And for those of us who are Christians, they are all children of God. That's how we see them all, and that's part of our reason for the service that we offer. It's to serve God's people as they need it, and as they really, to give them the most dignity and the best support that we can, because they are, like us, God's children.
Thank you. And finally, Grace.
Grace, you're on mute, by the way.
I'd say I've had thanks guys, good start. I'd say I'd have a couple of things strike me during coronavirus. So I think beforehand, a lot of my friends would say that what makes a person really valuable is something to do with sort of how productive they are, how much they can economically contribute to society. And I think that our response to COVID, whether or not you agree with the specifics of how we responded, the heart of it has been actually that's not what we value. We value people sort of relationally. And, we've said to people, we'd rather that you stopped contributing economically. We'd rather that you shielded if because we want to protect you. And so it's clearly not that we value humans for. And I think the second thing that struck me is I think we were trending as a society towards valuing the virtual and thinking that was just the same as the physical. And I think that sort of comes down to, we can interact mentally, that's just the same. But I can tell you on intensive care, we've had to limit our family visits, which has been really hard. And seeing a loved one talk to their family member on a ventilator via Zoom, anyone will tell you it is not the same as being by them physically and holding their hand. And I think COVID has highlighted that we are not just our minds, that the physical bodies matter, that we are embodied beings. And I guess that gift of true presence, I feel like that has just been highlighted time and time again in COVID. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your wonderful considerations. So now we're going to go to the part of the event where we ask each panelist a specific question, kind of to do with what they're doing in their jobs and other roles. So I think we're first going to start with Alice. So I'll be introducing the question, and then each panelist will talk for about 5 minutes about their answer. So yeah, so the first question is basically that crises remind us that we are all fragile and susceptible to getting sick and even dying suddenly. In general, human beings make plans for the future, thinking that we can control our lives. But a small virus, a microorganism that we cannot even see, is enough to completely alter our routines and destroy our plans. So the question is, how have you been able to deal with the stress and grief of working on the front lines of COVID?
Nice, small question. So they're two slightly different things. So at the height of the crisis, I was working on neurocritical care. For those of you who know Addenbrooke's Hospital, that critical care unit normally looks after patients with brain injuries and as a consequence of trauma. And we partitioned about 50% of our care over to patients with COVID, but we had to keep 50% of our care running because patients still have head injuries, they still crash their cars, they still try and commit suicide, and we still have to pick up those pieces. And I think going back to Grace's comment, that was one of the hardest things to deal with for me, was actually COVID. I could kind of get my head around. Medically, it's not complicated on critical care with COVID. You turn up the oxygen until you can turn up the oxygen no longer. You roll them on their front because that helps their breathing. And if that doesn't work, you talk to Papworth about cardiopulmonary bypass, so bypassing their lungs. And the big centre in Papworth either says yes or no. And actually, there was very little I could do to intervene other than do my job. But for the patients who were awake and who were dealing with the consequences of a car injury or a neck injury that meant they'd never walk again, or the families who were dealing with the sister who'd come to stay with them and had jumped off the roof because she couldn't cope any longer with her mental health problems, that was really hard. How do you say to someone, no, you can't come in and visit your sister? No, you can't come in and visit your 18-year-old son who's dealing with life-changing injuries. But you can talk to them through Skype. Like, it's not the same. And I think I became incredibly grateful for the companionship I have at home, so my husband's support. I became incredibly grateful for the physical. So God's beautiful creation, the space outside, being able to celebrate the small things, the sun rising each day felt like a bit of a victory. We got a puppy during lockdown. Her being and pooing outside in the morning rather than on the carpet felt like a victory. And I learned to celebrate the really small gifts that we get given every day by God, that I just took for granted. I took for granted waking up in a warm bed next to my husband. I took for granted having a nice breakfast, a cup of coffee. And then the community. I mean, the community of doctors and nurses on critical care was exceptional. We pulled together. I had conversations with colleagues I never would have normally had. And I think we, again, go back to Reese's comment, that kind of embodied presence. In some ways, I had it easy. I had a purpose, something to do during COVID, and I had people who got what I was going through. Many people didn't have that. But ultimately, it came back to a lot of it came back to my faith, a belief that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. And that reassurance that, you know what, today has enough worries of its own. Don't start worrying about tomorrow. So a lot of it was about learning to live in the present, learning to thank God for the small things, realizing that we are definitely not gods. I can't save a life. I can put a tube in someone's airway. I can give them 100% oxygen, but I can't save a life. All I can do is buy time. And that's very humbling, but very empowering at the same time. I endeavored to do the best for my patients. I helped set up the whole Skype system for calling families, but ultimately, it wasn't stuff to carry on my shoulders. As painful as it was, calling in families to say goodbye, all I could do was ensure I had a really good conversation with them, that I snuck as many into the critical care unit as possible behind the sister's back to say goodbye, and that we did everything in the most dignified way possible. That was my responsibility, but it wasn't actually my responsibility to hold their lives in my hand. And that was a very freeing feeling, that actually that was in God's hand, and that he loved these people dearly. He grieved alongside the families when they died, and he celebrated when they survived. But yeah, I'm gonna hand it back to someone else.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alice. Just before we move on, just to mention, the Q&A is now open for people to put in questions. There's a Google Docs in the comments, Google Docs form in the comments below, and please bring in your questions and we will get those answered at the end. But for now, we're moving on to a question from Margaret. Margaret, you've been working for the Cambridge Food Bank the whole way through this crisis. And I'm sure that you've seen the biggest needs in Cambridge change during this time. So my question for you is, on what grounds do you think we should try so hard to protect the vulnerable, the elderly, the marginalised and the poor?
Well, I think the important thing is to remember that a society is really judged by its care for those people who are on the edges of society, those people who are struggling. It's easy to say, you know, we're going to support the people who are healthy and rich, and just leave aside those people who are poor and struggling. And I think that's one of the things that's really important. You know, the people that we see come in, particularly during the pandemic, they are people who never ever thought they would be using a food bank. But because of things like furlough, redundancies, sickness, we've seen people come in from, you know, they've got degrees, they were working happily in a professional capacity in a company, then they get sick, or their work is no longer available because it's been shut down, or they've had to cut back. And so they end up, they've still got their mortgages to pay, they've still got their car loans to pay, they don't want to admit to their friends that they are struggling, and so they end up coming to the food bank, and we're just glad to be there for them. And one of the things we've seen during the last few months has been a big increase in the number of families who are using the food bank. You know, people who are struggling to put food on their children's tables, and that's an awful thing to have to face. Yeah, and it was the first few weeks of the pandemic, particularly, we were incredibly busy. Then it settled down a bit. Now we're seeing it picking up again. But actually, one of the things that I would, when we were frantically trying to move the food bank from its sort of, open doors, people could come in with their vouchers. So we were trying to restructure our teams, working on the idea that we didn't actually know whether we'd have a team from one day to the next because there was the risk that somebody would get sick. And we're starting to see that again now. One of the real messages I've had through this is that, what God was saying to me, the mission is bigger than any of you. It's my mission, and I'm not going to let it fail. And I think that really helped me to get through some of the really difficult things. The fact that actually, God was with me the whole way through, and he could do it. I couldn't, but in his strength and with him, the mission would get through. We would be able to feed all these people. We would be able to keep the distribution centres open and staffed and stocked. And that's what we've been able to do, and to just keep people fed. And I think that's, if you think the number of times that Jesus fed people, that was a big part of his work. He would feed people. He would say to his disciples, find them something to eat. That is something you do for me. And I think that's one of the things that also underpins us, is that, it's part of God's command to us is feed people.
Yeah. And maybe just further on that, what was the type of responses you got both from the people who came to the food bank, but also the volunteers? What type of dialogues were occurring?
So it's been interesting, because normally we would let people into the food bank distribution centres. Most of our distribution centres are in churches, and they would be able to sit and have a cup of tea and a chat with our volunteers. And that's something that we really value, and it's something that our clients really value. And that was something we had to stop doing. But it's surprising how many people they still want somebody to chat to. They still value that listening ear. And that's something we've, as well as we can, bearing in mind that we have to keep, initially 2 meters apart, now maybe 1 meter apart if we're outside, and we've got to have face shields and masks, and because obviously we have to be aware of the safety of our volunteers, and also not spreading the virus around our visitors. But it's surprising how much we can do with those conversations, just to be able to talk to people.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. That was so encouraging to hear. So because time is short, we have to press on with the questions. So the next question is for James. So basically, that death and dying has become politicized during the pandemic, and we kind of have to prioritize whose lives we value most. Can we ignore some lives? Do we leave others to die? What do we do with our limited resources? Are some lives more useful to protect? Are some lives too expensive to protect? Coronavirus has also made us acutely aware of mortality and how little we can actually control in our lives. It has also made many of us, very anxious, paranoid, or obsessive. So this is quite a personal question, but does dying scare you in any way? And what has your life experience and your experience in running charities told you about what makes lives worth living?
Well, I love that you've given me the easy questions there. That's fine. So obviously there's a couple of questions there. I think in answer to can we ignore some lives, can we leave some people to die, I think I'm going to go with an easy no with that one. But I think it is a really interesting question. You said, whose lives should we value the most? And I think we value everyone's lives equally, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we treat everybody equally, and that we allocate our resources equally. So when I think I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about valuing people unequally, because everyone's value is, each life is just as valuable as another. But one of the, I think, effects that I've seen from my perspective, running a charity that works with vulnerable people, working in a general practice in an incredibly deprived area with an awful lot of really struggling patients, is that one of the effects of corona is that we are continuing to widen the inequalities in our society. So as a general thumb, if you're relatively well-to-do and you're fairly well off during the pandemic, yes, your life will have been tougher, but you maybe won't have felt the same effects of some of the individuals that we see at places like Number 11, some of the individuals we see coming into our GP practice. And there's an awful lot of people I see, kids that I would see, for whom actually home isn't a safe place. And so lockdown can become incredibly dangerous for, or we see kids who are seeing the knock-on effects of education being moved from a school where there isn't a level playing field as it is, to homes where that kind of playing field becomes further and further apart. And we're seeing a lot of our clients who are really struggling, exactly as Margaret identifies, with the jobs impact, with the mental health impact, and it does affect classes differently. And I think we have a responsibility as society, and obviously I say this as a Christian because it's something that the Bible advocates for. The Bible, much to many people's surprise, talks more about justice than it talks about any other topic. And I think many people, when they tell me what it means to be a Christian, will talk to me about prayer, or they'll talk to me about giving your money, or they'll talk to me about a number of things like church and so forth. But actually, other than kind of God himself, the topic the Bible majors on more than anything is serving the poor, the vulnerable, the homeless, the orphan, the widow, and so forth. And so I think we have a responsibility as a society to prioritise those people. And actually, obviously, my interest is in public health. That makes sense from a public health point of view as well. As you reduce inequalities in a country, actually that supports kind of the wealth of the entire country. And so it's not just compassionate, it's also very prudent and sensible. And so I am a very, very strong advocate for the fact that we should be focusing on our resources more on the poor and vulnerable. I absolutely wouldn't want to be in charge of our country's corona response at the moment, because obviously we're trying to weigh up the fact that we want to limit the impact of the virus, which is incredibly important. But we also have to understand that as lockdowns continue to go on, the people at the kind of lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum are going to get hit harder by those lockdowns. And I think there's some really, really difficult decisions to make there in terms of how we support those people. But I think as a general principle, and obviously everyone listening into this Zoom call, you are all Cambridge educated individuals. You will have an opportunity to go and make a real impact on the world. And I think that is something probably to bear in mind, that we have a responsibility as a society, not just an intellectual and prudent responsibility, but also in a response to kind of showing our compassion to those members of society that are going to be hit the hardest. So I think that would be my answer to the first question, that yes, I absolutely think we should skew the way we invest our resources. I won't mention the north-south divide at all. Grace is in Liverpool, so she's smiling as well, that's fine. But yeah, looking at whether we invest in our resources in the communities that are the most vulnerable and are the poorest. But yeah, I think your second question was about anxiety, wasn't it? And everyone being very anxious, and does dying scare me? I think I would like to say with all confidence, no, dying doesn't scare me. That answer may change on different days, but actually, as a Christian, I believe that death isn't the end. Death is just the next step. And from that point of view, dying doesn't scare me. But also, I think you've mentioned, obviously, from your experience running charities and what makes life worth living. I think for me, my experience of becoming a Christian has been quite profound in that. And I remember a long time ago, probably 10 years or so ago, when I decided I wanted to become a doctor, I was quite ill for a period. And I remember a very specific moment in an MRI scanner where things were looking not too fantastic and were looking quite bleak. And I was kind of facing the possibility of my own mortality. And I remember very, very clearly thinking that I wasn't necessarily scared to die, but I was really scared that I'd completely missed out on the whole point of life. I'd completely wasted my time here on earth. And I think, as Grace touched on a little bit in her answer, it's very easy to think that life is about chasing your career, or it's about chasing whether it's money or relationships or power or whatever it might be, and those things are all attractive things, but I think we will all recognize they never bring contentment, and we're always chasing more and chasing more. And for me, I think what changes that question for me, and what stops me being scared, and what helps me to experience joy in the midst of a lockdown, joy in the midst of corona, is actually knowing that there is a comfort in being part of God's bigger story. There's a freedom that comes from that, and it not being all about yourself, not being focused in on yourself, and actually setting yourself free of those worldly expectations and responsibilities. And I think when you mentioned kind of the anxiety, I think that is just an incredible breath of fresh air. And that is something that I think my faith really impacts on a day-to-day, being part of kind of God's bigger story. And it not just being about me and my value to society through my kind of economic and productivity output. So yeah, I hope that gives a rough answer.
Yeah, some really important and really insightful things there. Thank you so much, James. Yeah, so finally, we've got a question for Grace. So this kind of leads on from some stats, short stats, which I'm going to read out. So these are from a study from Arizona University of what Americans think about human life. So the study found that 69% of Americans see humans as basically good. 12% claims that people are simply material substance, biological machines. Answering another question, 37% offered views such as life is what you make it, but it has no absolute value. And 11% said that life has no infinite unconditional value. So Grace, as a doctor, what makes human life valuable?
So I guess you two as second year medical students will be learning that the more that you try and do medicine, it's all about restoring human health. And so you have to navigate difficult ethical issues because you're asking what is it to be human and what is it to be healthy? I think when I talk to friends about it, some of them say things like, well, human life is valuable because we've got that enshrined in law. So we've got all these human rights laws, and we're valuable because of that. That sort of seems the wrong way around to me. I think that the government is recognizing something intrinsically valuable about humans rather than conferring something valuable onto humans. And I think that's why when there are unjust laws, so if the government tomorrow said that women didn't have a right to life, I would not suddenly think that I've lost my value. I would think that the government had lost its way. I guess I come from an Eastern European background, and I guess when I've spoken to say ex-Soviet states, other people have argued that what gives a human value is their productivity in society, kind of what they can contribute to the state. Or when I was studying, I think particularly at Cambridge or Oxford, then somebody's mind might be what people argue gives them value, what they can think. And I really have wrestled with this. And I've particularly been wrestling with it when I've had I had a very intense season where my little nephew was born. And then at the same time, my nana was becoming very unwell. She had myeloma, a form of cancer, was in and out of hospital. And I was seeing my nephew sitting on my nana's lap, and I was thinking, neither of them can contribute to society right now. They just can't. And I don't think my nephew realistically even knew who I was. I don't think he was aware of me. And so I was thinking that the worldview of thinking that we're valuable because of what we can do didn't seem to be how I lived out my life. It didn't seem to be why I loved my nephew or my nana. And I thought, it's not a very useful worldview if it's not actually practically applicable. And it sort of seemed to me a bit like a scientific theory. You can have a beautiful theory that seems really sensible, and then you do an experiment and it doesn't work, and then you sort of say, well, fine, it's probably a wrong theory. And I think that was kind of where I got to with that way of thinking. And I was thinking instead, okay, so what is it that's intrinsically valuable in humans that our laws are trying to recognize and that we as medics are trying to restore? And I find that Christianity has an answer to that. And I think it's important to distinguish that. I'm not saying that only Christians think that humans have intrinsic value. As I say, I think all of human rights law recognizes that value, but I think Christians can go a step further into explaining why we think that's the case. They can actually have a logical rationale for that. And And ultimately, I think that's because humans are, we're told, sort of the Christian teaching is that humans are made in the image of God, that God is 3 persons, 1 substance, sort of a perfect, loving community. And that humans are intrinsically valuable because we reflect something of the divine. And I think that explains why we care so much about the weak and the vulnerable, as we've seen in COVID. That explains why we care about justice, that we don't just say, yeah, let the weak go, survival of the fittest. And I think it explains why we feel such a power of love. So yeah, I think what makes a human life valuable is that it's human and that it's made in the image of God.
Thank you so much, Grace. Rohan, do you want to take over?
Yeah, so now we're going to go on to a short Q&A, maybe for about 10 or so minutes. So I think you can put questions in the YouTube chat. So the first one is aimed to one of the doctors on the panel. So they say, what do you think the trade-off should be between protecting physical health by stopping COVID and protecting mental health by relaxing the guidelines? Yeah, open to any of the doctors.
So I'm going to push back on the question a little bit. I don't think that's dichotomous. Mental health is part of physical health and physical health is part of mental health. I struggle with that separation as being something different. And actually relaxing guidelines and lockdown is about more than just allowing people to socialise and get back their mental health. It actually allows them to look after their physical health. We know that financial deprivation is associated with poorer physical health. So actually that's not the reason for relaxing lockdown. Shouldn't be a protection of mental health. Of course it will help. But for those who are anxious about COVID, it might make things worse. They might be more anxious. And what we're actually asking is, how do we balance the impact of the economic cost? That means that many people will struggle for jobs and work and see a decline in their physical health, and that long-term health picture versus the short-term, here are some numbers on the page. And a note of caution, as doctors, we see one thing, at least as critical care doctors, and you'll hear lots of us on Twitter getting frustrated about lockdown. We see COVID deaths. That's our experience. It's horrible. It's not fun. We don't see people losing their jobs and their slow decline in health. GPs see that. We didn't become GPs for a reason. We don't like that stuff. And so actually, all of us have a world view on this. All of us have gotten to experience that biases our view. And therefore, actually, it's going to be a really difficult decision. And I think we're going to probably reach a point where we're going to have to start relaxing things because we're seeing a decline in general population public health, something James can probably speak into more. But the government is never going to be held to account for that. They're only going to be held to account for COVID death numbers. And that is always going to be playing in the back of mind. We're always going to be playing a numbers game, and we can't quantify the cost on the poorest and most vulnerable in our society who are going to be affected by this 10, 15, 20 years down the line with their loss of education, their loss of just creeping health, their loss of job, ending up on the dole. I don't know if James wants to add anything to that from a kind of more non-critical care side.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say exactly what you said about it isn't really a question of physical and mental health. It's a question of immediate COVID impact versus long-term kind of health outcomes. I think it is an incredibly difficult question. I think if anyone had the answer to this, they would be a very, very rich person indeed, because you're not going to be able to get an answer. But I think one of my realizations, I think, over the last couple of months is obviously I'm a doctor, I have a master's in public health, and I still don't have the foggiest on what the best strategy for us would be going forward. And I think it's to recognise that a lot of the people in positions of responsibility at the moment, so I'm thinking of Chris Whitty and so forth, these are people who've spent their entire lives studying how populations are affected by pandemics, not just the pandemic itself, but also, as we're starting to see in GP, an awful lot of our whether it's cancer referrals, whether it's mental health, as you've identified, whether it's disease follow-ups for things like COPD and diabetes, which are really important. I think a lot of maybe non-medics don't understand a lot of time that the way you save lives is normally through a slow, methodical process, rather than an incredibly exciting moment on the TV where you're jumping up and down on someone's chest. That's certainly the minority rather than the majority. And I think one of the things that we have to do is, as difficult as it can be, and I don't want to get political at all, but as difficult as it can be, have trust in the people who are making those decisions. And then it is, the waters are very muddied when politics get involved, but certainly I look to Public Health England and bodies like that, and they have an incredibly difficult job. And I don't think there is an answer to that question that any of us would be able to give. But I think it's recognising that there is absolutely a balance to be had, but I think the best people to make the decision on that balance isn't me. And so as much as I have opinions sometimes, and as much as I think, oh, it is wrong that we're doing this, or it's wrong that we're doing this, actually I have to defer to those with a greater experience than myself. And that can be really tough sometimes, having to acknowledge that your opinion isn't the most important.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, James and Alice. Please do continue to send in questions on the chat function on YouTube, and there's also a Google form below, so please send in your questions. But next we've got a good question here. Anyone please answer. The question is, I see how Christianity can help give you a good perspective on these things. So I think health, humanity, and the value of life. But can't you get that in other ways?
I'll jump in a bit there. So I guess for me, the question is not so much, is it a helpful perspective, though that's useful. So as I say, I want my worldview to actually be how I live out my life. I'd like it to be logically consistent. The primary question for me personally, just the way I operate, is something true? So I'm not looking just for something that feels comfortable for me. I'm looking for something that's true, because ultimately the perspective that you have on why is human life valuable, what is it to be human, there are logical implications for all of this. It has implications for how you treat the elderly and the vulnerable. It has implications for how you argue for social justice. If there's no such thing as right or wrong, then why bother to persuade anyone of what is in fact just your personal opinion? You're not saying murder is wrong, you're saying I don't like murder. And someone else can quite rightly just say, well, I do. And then you're at a stalemate. Whereas if you think there's such a thing as truth and moral right or wrong, it really changes how you engage in that. So I think, and that obviously there are lots of faiths that would say that there is truth. Christianity is not the only one claiming that there is a truth. I would say that it's probably a secular worldview that claims there's not moral truths, or at least doesn't know where to ground those moral truths in. And then I guess the question would be for me, so if, is there evidence for a God? Is there philosophical evidence for the beginning of the universe? And that's one of the primary ways that I came to believe that there was a God. And then I would ask, okay, so which God described in all these what claim to be holy texts, which one is it, if you believe that there is a God, if there's something that brings the universe into existence, someone? And then I would just test it. Christianity makes a lot of historical truth claims. The central one being that there was a man called Jesus, he claimed to be God, who died and rose again. And that is a historical truth claim. So I attacked that like it was history. So for me, it's not. So it was helpful to think, is my worldview consistent? But then if it's going to be consistent, it also it must be true. So I think there's different ways. I only want to live my life in truth. Everything else just feels like a waste of time.
Yeah, thank you so much. And there's another question which says, it's a bit of a challenging one, but I'll leave it open to all our panelists. If God grieves death, why do people die?
Gosh, very difficult question to answer when I don't know who's asked that question. I would answer it are we talking about, is it an intellectual question of why do people die, or if you're going through a period of grieving and grief, it's a slightly different response? I would say that God definitely grieves death. You see Jesus crying at the tomb of his friend Lazarus. It's not how we intended this world to be. That's very clear throughout the Bible, that God created a world with order, and death is a consequence of disorder. There's a simple answer, that sort of goes down to the idea that humanity has chosen to walk its own path. We see that again and again. We think we know better than God, and he's a God that allows us to make our own decisions, and that has led to disorder, and disorder leads to death. But if that's from a Cambridge student and they want to grab a coffee and talk about it for closer to an hour or more, I'm more than happy to have them put in touch with me, because I don't think that's a question we can easily tackle over Zoom. But someone else is welcome to give it a go.
And just to touch lightly on the question before, as well as in terms of perspective, I think it's really key here to realise that we can all live our lives in truthful ways without having a rationale for that. So I think it's just really important to recognise that Christians would say that they have a reason that they believe X or Y, but a lot of people believe and act in ways that are, put many of us to absolute shame. But it's whether or not there's a grounding for that. And yeah, I agree with Alice in terms of that answer of why do people die. I think, there's what's a logical explanation, and then there's just the fact that suffering needs a presence. So I think sometimes that's just something that you need to be with someone and talk through in person a lot more.
Okay, so if we don't have any more questions for our panelists, we can move on to a final question that to close this panel event. So I'll just wait for a moment or so. But yeah, I'd want to take this opportunity once again to thank all the people who have participated. Oh, okay, we have one more. It's a bit personal, but how has the coronavirus pandemic affected your faith? Do you feel like your trust in God? Do you feel like you trust in God more or less?
I'll have to go. So for actually me, I think one of the things across my life, I can kind of pinpoint several moments, but have been really defining for my faith. But I think Corona has been one of them. I think my faith has got significantly stronger during the pandemic, because I think it forced an awful lot of people to kind of sit down and recognize, actually, where does my security come from? Where does my strength come from? Where does my, as Grace has kind of been alluding to, what is the central truth of my life? What do I hold to? And I think just because you are a Christian doesn't mean that you get that right all the time. As a Christian, I will spend a lot of my time putting my security in my job or in my friends and family and things like that, because it's a very natural thing for us to do. And I suppose a lot of the battle you have throughout your Christian life is actually learning to, as good as those things can be, not let them be central and not let them be kind of front and center. And I think for me, Corona has been a really good time to stop and take a breath, stop and sit back when everything kind of shut down for a while, and think, actually, hold on a minute, work's been really difficult. I wasn't in GP at the start of the pandemic. I was on the medical wards, which weren't the nicest. We had an awful lot of people kind of passing away, and I was like, actually, is work where my joy comes from? Is work where my strength comes from? Is being able to spend time with my friends where my strength comes from? And as a result of that, I spent an awful lot more time kind of getting stuck into my Bible, an awful lot more time actually kind of spending time in prayer and recognizing there is a significant joy that comes from, again, I think we've alluded to a few times, but the joy that Jesus promises us, and that is life, and life is all its fullness. And there's a fantastic verse in the Bible which a guy called Paul, who wrote an awful lot of letters in the New Testament, talks about learning the secret to contentment. And actually, the way he learns that secret is learning to put God up above all things, because God is this immovable presence, this kind of all-consuming story. And actually, when you fix your identity and fix who you are into that story, that kind of big narrative, little changing things within the world don't shake me as much as they used to anymore. If I've got problems at work, the charity that I run, we're currently about £150,000 short for next year. It's stressful, but actually I'm nowhere near as stressed as I used to be about things like that, because that's not my primary focus. I'm learning to fix my eyes and my perspective on that bigger story. And so I think in a weird way, the coronavirus pandemic has been great for that. And I know many others that I've spoken to, whether they're Christians or not, have maybe started to explore faith in a much deeper way through the pandemic than they had done previously.
Thank you, James. We've got a question for Margaret, for the same question, please. So it's, how has the coronavirus pandemic affected your faith? Do you feel like you trust in God less?
I would say, if anything, I trust in God more, because I've actually found through the pandemic, when I've seen, so many people struggling, I know people who have had coronavirus. Actually, my daughter is currently recovering from it, fortunately, and I hope she continues to do so. But I think a lot of it is just that throughout this whole thing, God is with us, and He's not going to let go. And I think that's one of the big things. There's a song, "Oh no, you never let go," through the calm through the storm. I think that's definitely one of the things that I sort of have, is that God will not let go. And whatever the pandemic is throwing at us, whether that's extra work, extra people coming in, far more really difficult stories, personal problems with the virus, the stories that I know many of you guys are facing with people actually dying. God will still be there, and it's just that extra strength. And I think that's one of the big things I've really got out of this, is just the core strength that God provides. The rest of it can just sort of, it can be worked through. But God is the core, the heart, and that constant love and support, the hand that will never let you go. So I trust in God more through this, not less.
That's wonderful to hear. Thank you, Margaret. So you've got a final question, if maybe one person could answer this. But kind of linking to what you were saying, Margaret, about God's love. The Bible has a lot to say about the value, this intrinsic value of human life. It says that God made us, that we are wonderfully made, that we are precious and honoured in His sight, and that He has called us by name and we are His. And it says that He loves us with an everlasting love. So if one person could please answer this final, what has God's love? How does it that you see life?
So I think that the internet's got a little bit cut when Wei was asking the final question. So I'll just repeat it in case anyone missed it. So could maybe just one person answer this final question? What has God's love done for you? And how does His love transform the way you see life? So open to one of the panelists.
I mean,
it's a question we all want to answer. God's done everything and it transforms everything. I'm going to let Grace answer in a bit more detail than that, though, I think.
I was going to say, I think everyone's probably keen to answer that, because I guess God's love for me has radically humbled me, I would say. It's given me a certainty when, especially during COVID, I've had a lot of people really struggling with suicidal ideation and just feeling so low and wondering, if I can't feel the value of my own life, does that mean it's meaningless? You know, if joy and pleasure is all there is and I'm not feeling joyful, then maybe there's no value. And I think seeing that your love is grounded, what your value is grounded in God, that you're loved so much that God entered this world, which at the moment, I think, you know, in the West, we're normally so shielded from the pain of this world, and it's broken in abruptly into us. And the fact that God entered the world for us, that in Jesus, we're told he sweat blood, which we even know now is scientifically possible, and then died on the cross. And I think being faced with death so much, I'm like, I can't believe that God loved us so much that he would die on the cross for us to reconcile us to him, which if people wanted to know more about, I'm sure one of you guys would be available to chat afterwards or give my email. I think that has just radically transformed the fact that when things are low, I know that love is unchanging, that even if I can't feel it, I know that love is a fact because I've seen it. And I guess it's just given me a constant in my life that my life feels grounded in. So yeah, it's completely changed my life. I'm sure that's true for everyone here.
Okay, so I think that's where we're planning to conclude the event. So yeah, on behalf of everyone, a massive thank you to all our panelists to giving their time up to discuss some of these quite complex and difficult issues with us. Thank you to Iona, was working behind the scenes non-stop to put this all together, and Richard and Alex for helping us with the tech to make everything as seamless as possible. And a huge thank you to everyone, all our viewers at home. And without you guys, these events just can't work at all. So thank you so much for coming to watch. And we hope this talk gave you some food for thought, and we'd love to hear more from you. So the Google form will still be open if you have any further questions, and I'm sure all the panelists would be really happy to get back to you if you had any specific questions for them. So yeah, that's all from us. So take care, everyone, and bye for now.
We're a collective of students around Cambridge who do things together and in smaller groups of colleges. We come from a range of different backgrounds, and we want everyone and anyone to be able to find a family with us.
We're a space to freely explore the claims of Jesus and what they mean for our lives if they are true. We openly discuss what God has for our lives, as well as our questions, doubts, and differences. We love talking about God and to Him, and we want to love Him more.
There are groups in each college that meet during the week to chat, eat, read the Bible, pray, share stories, drink tea, and sometimes even sing. We also hold events in term time, which are a place to explore the big questions of life. And in Lent term, we put on a whole week of events for the whole university.